There is a kind of laughter that brings people together, and there is a kind that quietly takes someone apart. Family Feud has always been a show about laughter. Steve Harvey built his version of it on warmth, on the shared comedy of ordinary life, on the understanding that laughing together is one of the things that makes a family a family. The audience understands this. The families who compete understand this. The laughter is part of the deal. But what happened during one particular taping was a different kind of laughter entirely. A husband stood at that podium and shared something real, something that had cost him, and his wife laughed. Not the warm, we're in this together laugh of a long marriage, the dismissive kind, the kind that says I don't take this seriously, the kind that says neither should you. The audience shifted in their seats. The other family went quiet, and Steve Harvey, who has built a career on knowing the difference between laughter that heals and laughter that harms, set the microphone down and got serious. What he said next was not scripted. It was not planned. It came from a man who has known struggle himself, who has lost everything and rebuilt, who has spoken publicly about failure and shame, and the particular silence of a man who is going through something hard and does not feel safe enough to say so. It changed the room. And for the man at that podium, it changed something much larger than the room. This is the story of what Steve Harvey said, and why it mattered. James Foster was 58 years old, a former construction foreman from Louisville, Kentucky, who had spent 30 years building things for other people, and at the age of 53 lost the capacity to do so when a fall from scaffolding left him with a spinal injury that ended his career in a single afternoon. He had been a physical man his entire life, the kind of man defined by his ability to show up, lift what needed lifting, solve problems with his hands and his presence. He had coached his son's little league teams. He had built the back porch of his house himself, board by board, over 3 weekends in the fall of 2009. He had driven to work every morning for 3 decades with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a person who knew exactly what he was for. The injury had taken all of that. Not cleanly, not in a single moment of acknowledged grief, but gradually, in the way that losses of identity accumulate. Each small withdrawal from the person you understood yourself to be arriving quietly, without ceremony, until one morning you look in the mirror and are not entirely sure who is looking back. He had struggled with that. In ways he had not spoken about publicly, in ways he had mostly not spoken about at all, because James Foster was a man of his generation and his upbringing, and the men of his generation and upbringing did not, as a general rule, discuss their internal landscape with other people. They managed it. They kept moving. They found other things to do with the hands that were no longer useful for the thing those hands had always done. He had managed it imperfectly. There had been a period of withdrawal, from friends, from activities, from the easy social confidence he had once carried without thinking about it. His sons had noticed. His sister had called more often than usual, and Renee, his wife of 29 years, had, as she would later describe it, chosen not to make a big deal of it, because making a big deal of things was not how they operated, because James would not have wanted that, because, in the way of couples who have been together long enough to develop routines of avoidance, they had simply not talked about it directly. Renee Foster was 56, a school administrator with a practical mind and an organized household, and the brisk, capable manner of a woman who has kept a great deal running simultaneously for a very long time. She was not without warmth. Her staff liked her, her children adored her, her friends described her as the person you called when something needed to be sorted out. But her warmth expressed itself most naturally through competence rather than tenderness. Through solving rather than sitting with, she had watched James struggle and, not knowing what to do with what she was watching, had developed a habit of lightening it, of making small jokes about his adjustment to retirement, of teasing him about the projects he started and didn't finish, of treating the whole difficult period as a phase that was slightly amusing in its duration. It was, she would later acknowledge, a coping mechanism, a way of not sitting in the discomfort of watching her husband diminished by something she could not fix. She had not understood because James had never told her what it actually cost him, every day, To be the man who could no longer do the thing that had made him feel like a man. Their youngest son, Devin 27, had entered the family. He had grown up watching his father, watching the fall, the withdrawal, the slow and effortful climb back toward something resembling himself, and had arrived at adulthood with a clarity about his father that James did not have about himself. He had written on the application, "My dad is the strongest person I know, not because he's never been knocked down, because of what it took for him to get back up. I want him to know that we see that." The family had come to Los Angeles in the early fall. James, Renee, Devin, and two of James's old friends from the construction industry, men who had known him before the injury and had stayed close after. The kind of friends who don't require explanation. James had not wanted to come. He had said the show was not really his thing. Devin had said that was fine. They could just go and have a good time, no pressure. James had looked at his son for a moment and agreed, in the way that fathers agree to things their children ask, for when they understand that the asking is its own kind of statement. On the day of the taping, James wore a navy shirt that Devin had picked out. He sat in the green room and talked quietly with his two old friends about baseball, about the drive from the airport, about nothing in particular, the easy, unhurried conversation of men who have known each other long enough not to need topics. He walked onto the stage looking like what he was, a solid, careful, private man stepping into an environment that was none of those things. He looked, Steve Harvey would later note, like someone who had shown up because someone he loved had needed him too, which was, in its own way, exactly who James Foster had always been. The Foster family played against the Ningayan family from Houston, and from the first round it was a competitive, warm contest between two groups of people who were clearly enjoying themselves. James was quieter than the others, more measured in his answers, less expressive in his reactions, but steady. He answered well when it was his turn. He watched with focused attention when it wasn't. The audience took to him in the way audiences take to people who are not performing, with a particular, reliable affection for someone who seems simply, genuinely present. Renee, beside him, was louder and more animated. She high-fived wrong answers. She did a small victory gesture when the board lit up. She was, in the language of game show energy, exactly what producers hope for. The audience liked her too, in a different way. The way you like a person who brings the energy that a room needs. Steve moved between them easily, reading the dynamic with the experienced eye of someone who has spent years understanding marriages through the way people stand next to each other. He filed what he was seeing and kept things moving. The family made it through 2 rounds. The game was close. The mood in the studio was easy and good. And then Steve asked a question that changed the temperature. "We surveyed 100 people," Steve announced. "Name something a man struggles with that he never talks about." The question carried more weight than its game show context would suggest. It is the kind of category that lands differently depending on who is standing at the podium and what they are carrying. In the right moment, it is just a question. In the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on how you see it, it is an invitation. Steve turned to James. It was his turn at the front of the group. He looked at the question on the board, and something in his expression shifted. A small, almost imperceptible settling, like a man who has been asked a question he knows the answer to from the inside rather than the outside. "Feeling like you've lost your purpose," James said. He did not say it loudly. He said it the way James Foster said most things, directly, without ornamentation, with the plain precision of a man who does not waste words. The board lit up. It was on the survey, a significant number of points. The audience applauded. Steve nodded with something more than game show approval. And then, before the moment could be absorbed and moved past, Renee laughed. Not cruelly, not with malice, but with the quick, reflexive laugh of someone who does not realize, in the moment, what they are laughing at. She shook her head slightly, a small gesture that said something like typical James, always so dramatic. And she said, "He's been talking about that since he retired. 3 years of hearing about his purpose." She was still smiling when she said it. The audience gave a small, uncertain laugh. The kind that follows someone else's laugh when people are not sure if they are supposed to join in. James looked at the board. His jaw set, just slightly. Steve Harvey did not laugh. The studio felt it, that particular atmospheric change that occurs when a room recalibrates around a moment it did not expect. The laughter faded faster than it should have. The audience settled back into their seats with a slightly different quality of attention. Steve looked at Renee. His expression was not unkind. It was never unkind. But it was no longer the easy, entertained expression of a host in a comfortable game. It was the expression of a man who has heard something that requires a response. 3 years. Steve said to Renee evenly. Renee, catching the tone, nodded, still smiling but with slightly less certainty than a moment ago. He went through a lot when he had to stop working, she said, in the modified register of someone beginning to understand they may have misjudged the room. It was a big adjustment. A big adjustment? Steve repeated. He turned to James. You want to tell me about that? James looked at his wife, then at Steve, then at the floor briefly, in the way of private men who are deciding whether a public space is worth the truth. He decided. I was a foreman for 30 years, he said. I had a crew. I had a job that required me every single day. My back gave out and I had to stop and... He paused. The pause was not for effect. It was for honesty. I didn't know who I was without it. And that was hard to admit, and I haven't really admitted it to many people. The room was completely still, including her, Steve said gently, not as an accusation, as a clarification. James was quiet for a moment. Including her, he confirmed. Renee Foster had stopped smiling. She was looking at her husband of 29 years with an expression that was navigating rapidly between several things at once. Surprise, recognition, and the particular quality of discomfort that arrives when you realize that a joke you have been making for 3 years has been landing somewhere you never intended it to land. James, she started. It's okay, he said, automatically, in the tone of a man who has been saying it's okay for 3 years. No, Steve said. Let's stay here for a minute. Steve Harvey turned to address both of them, not the audience, not the camera, but James and Renee standing at that podium, and what he said came from somewhere more personal than a hosting instinct. I want to talk about something for a minute, he said, because this happens more than people know, and it almost never gets talked about. He looked at James. A man who loses the thing that gave him his sense of purpose. Whether that's a job, a career, a physical ability, something he built his whole identity around, goes through a grief that is real, that is legitimate. That is as serious as any other kind of grief, and the reason it doesn't get talked about is because somewhere along the way we decided that men aren't supposed to grieve those things. That you adjust, you move on, you find something else to do. That admitting the loss means something is wrong with you. He paused, letting that breathe. Nothing is wrong with you, he said to James. Losing 30 years of identity in one afternoon, that would floor anybody. The fact that you are standing here, that you rebuilt enough of yourself to walk onto this stage, that is not nothing. That is significant. James was very still. The two friends standing at the back of the group, the men who had known him before the injury and after, were watching him with the quiet, attentive expression of people who had been waiting a long time for someone else to say this. Steve turned to Renee. And I'm not going to put this on you, he said, because I understand what you were doing when the person you love is going through something hard and you can't fix it. And you are, clearly, a person who fixes things. Humor feels like the next best option. It feels like lightening the load, like keeping things from getting too heavy. Renee nodded very slightly, in the way of someone being accurately described. But here's what I need you to hear. Steve continued. When the person who is supposed to be your safe place laughs at the thing you're struggling with, even if the laughter comes from love, even if it comes from not knowing what else to do, what the other person hears is, I don't take your pain seriously. And a man who already doesn't feel safe enough to talk about his pain will take that and go even further inside. The studio was completely silent. James went further inside. Steve said, for 3 years. And you didn't know, because he didn't tell you, and you thought the jokes were okay because he didn't say they weren't. He looked between them. That is how good people hurt each other without meaning to. That is how a marriage full of love can still leave someone alone. Renee Foster was not a woman who cried easily. She had the practical, self-contained bearing of someone who had managed a school building for 17 years and understood that there was always another thing requiring attention. Crying in her personal hierarchy was something you did privately and briefly, and then you got back to it. But she was crying now. Not dramatically, quietly, the way composed people cry when the composure is no longer possible, and they are not sure when it slipped. "I didn't know it was that bad," she said. "I didn't. I thought the joking was. I thought it was our way of dealing with it, together." "It was your way," Steve said gently. "Was it his?" She looked at James. For a long moment she just looked at him. At this man she had been married to for 29 years, who had built the porch on their house, and coached their sons and driven to work every day for 30 years, and come home from a fall on scaffolding a different person, and whom she had watched struggle and responded to with jokes because she had not known what else to do and had not asked him what he needed instead. "No," she said. "It wasn't, James," Steve said, turning back to him. "Tell her what you needed. Not 3 years ago. Right now. What do you need from her?" James took a breath. He was not a man built for this kind of conversation in this kind of setting. Everything about him, the measured speech, the controlled expression, the way he had stood slightly apart from the group all afternoon, said that he processed things internally and released them slowly, if at all. But he had already gone further than he had planned to go, and somewhere in the going he had found that the floor was still there, that the room had not collapsed, that 200 strangers and his son and his 2 oldest friends were watching him say the hard thing, and none of them were laughing. "I just need you to take it seriously," he said. "I don't need you to fix it. I just need to know that you know it's real." Renee crossed the small space between them and put her arms around her husband. It was not a performance. There was nothing performed about it. It was the embrace of a woman who has just understood something she should have understood sooner and is closing the distance as directly as she knows how. James's arms came around her after a moment, slowly, in the way of private men who are not certain they are allowed this, and then fully, in the way of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just been given permission to put it down. Devin, in the back of the group, had his hand over his mouth. The 2 old friends from the construction industry were looking at each other with the expression of men who have known each other long enough that they do not need to speak to communicate. The audience rose. Steve Harvey watched it all with his hands clasped in front of him and said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "That," he said, "is what I'm talking about. Not the big gesture, not the grand speech, just 2 people closing the distance. That's all it ever is." The reason Steve Harvey's response landed the way it did, the reason it resonated with millions of viewers rather than the few hundred in that studio, is rooted in something most of those viewers already knew about him. Steve Harvey has not lived a sheltered life. He has spoken publicly and at length about periods in his own history marked by financial collapse, professional failure, and the particular shame of a man who could not provide for his family. He has described sleeping in his car. He has described the silence of those years, the way he did not talk about what he was going through, the way that silence compounded the difficulty. He was not speaking to James Foster from a platform of comfortable authority. He was speaking from the ground floor of a shared experience. The recognition in his voice when he described a man going further inside, away from vulnerability, away from the people who might have helped, was not theoretical, it was personal, and the audience, which knew his story, understood that. That is what gave his words their particular weight, not the platform, not the microphone, the fact that he had been in a version of that room himself and had come out the other side and was now standing in front of a man who was still in it. When the episode broadcast 6 weeks later, the clip moved through social media with the particular velocity of content that touches something people recognize privately but rarely see named publicly. Within the first 48 hours it had been viewed more than 18 million times. Within the week it had generated a volume of written response. comments, shared posts, open letters, that the Family Feud production team described as unprecedented in their recent history. The responses broke along lines that were revealing. Women wrote about watching the clip and understanding, for the first time, that the way they had been managing their husbands' difficult periods. The lightning, the joking, the determination not to make it bigger than it needed to be, had not been received the way it was intended, that what had felt like support from their side had felt like dismissal from his. Several women wrote that they had shown the clip to their husbands and that the conversation afterward was the most honest one they had managed in years. Men wrote in different terms, but with equal volume. The phrase that appeared most consistently across thousands of individual responses was a variation of, "I didn't know anyone else felt this way." The isolation of struggling silently, of carrying the loss of a role or a capacity or a version of yourself without the language or the permission to discuss it, had been named so precisely by both James's answer and Steve's response that men who had never had words for it found, suddenly, that they did. A veterans support organization in the Midwest shared the clip extensively, noting that it captured something they encountered constantly in their work: the particular difficulty men face in transitioning out of roles that had given them their sense of purpose and worth, and the way that the people closest to them often inadvertently added to that difficulty by minimizing what they were going through. In the follow-up segment produced 4 months after the broadcast, the producers found a couple that had not resolved everything. Real marriages do not resolve everything, and James Foster was not suddenly a man who talked openly and easily about his inner life, but that had moved, measurably and meaningfully, toward each other. Renee had stopped making the jokes. That was the first and most immediate change. She had stopped, and James had noticed, and the noticing had meant something to him even before anything else changed. The absence of a pattern that had minimized him was itself a form of acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was what he had said he needed. James had begun seeing a counselor, something Devon had quietly suggested months earlier and that James had dismissed, and that now, on the other side of what had happened in that studio, seemed more possible. He went once, then again. The counselor, he said in the follow-up interview, asked questions that nobody had asked him before, not about the injury itself, but about who he had been before it and who he was trying to become after. He was working on it, slowly, in his way. The show didn't fix anything, James said in the follow-up interview, with the directness that characterized everything he said. But it started something. It got us talking about something we had been walking around for 3 years. And once you start talking, it's harder to stop. Which is probably a good thing, Renee said. I thought I was handling it for him. I thought the lightness was helping. I had no idea it was landing the way it was landing. She paused. I should have asked. I never asked him what he needed. I just decided what he needed and provided that. I'm working on asking. In the follow-up, Devon Foster was asked why he had entered the family in the show, what he had been hoping for. I wasn't hoping for what happened, he said. I didn't plan that. I just wanted my dad to have a good day. I wanted him to feel like he searched for it. Like we showed up for him the way he's always showed up for us. He spent his whole life being the person who showed up, and after the injury he receded. And we all kind of let him, because we didn't know what else to do. I thought if we could just get him in a room where he was laughing and his friends were there, and he could remember that he was still somebody worth showing up for, that would be enough. He paused. What Steve Harvey gave him was more than that. He gave him language for something he'd been carrying without language, and once you have the words for a thing, you can start to work with it. Before that, you're just in the dark. The Foster family clip became one of several touchpoints in a broader public conversation about men, identity, and the specific grief of lost purpose. A conversation that mental health professionals, workplace counselors, and retirement advisors noted was long overdue and chronically underserved. The particular life stage that James represented, a man in his late 50s, physically capable until suddenly he was not, defined by a professional identity that had been removed without warning, is one that affects millions of people and is addressed, in most cultural frameworks, almost entirely in practical terms. What do you do next? What new purpose can you find? How do you stay busy? The emotional reality of the loss, the grief of the self that went with the job, is rarely the focus. Steve Harvey addressed that reality directly. He did not offer James a new purpose. He did not suggest ways to stay busy. He validated the grief itself. He said what you lost was real, what you feel about losing it is legitimate, and the fact that you have not talked about it does not mean it does not require talking about. That simple act of validation, unhurried, specific, unafraid of the weight of what it was acknowledging, was, by the account of the mental health professionals who referenced the clip in their work, exactly what was missing from most of the conversations men in James's position were having with the people around them. A year after the taping, James Foster had built something. Not in the physical, literal sense of his former work. The spinal injury had not resolved and would not, but in a different sense. He had found a program through a local community organization that paired experienced tradespeople with young men and women who were learning construction skills. He taught 2 evenings a week. He was not on the scaffolding. He was not swinging a hammer. But he was in a room with people who needed what he knew, and he was giving it to them, and the giving had reintroduced him to something he had not felt in 3 years. He still saw the counselor once a month. He still talked, slowly and in his way, about the things that were difficult. He still was not, by any measure, a man who wore his interior life on the outside. But he was talking, and Renee was asking. And those 2 things, simple as they sound, had changed the temperature of their household in a way that their sons noticed immediately and did not have to say anything about, because it was simply obvious. When asked what he would say to other men in the position he had been in 3 years ago, carrying the loss of purpose alone, finding it easier to go further inside than to speak, he was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet before he said something he meant. Find one person who can hear it, he said. It doesn't have to be your wife. It doesn't have to be a counselor. It can be one of your boys, somebody who's known you a long time. Just one person. Say the thing you haven't been saying. Because what I learned is that the thing gets bigger in the dark. It gets smaller when you let some light in. That's all. You don't have to tell everybody. Just don't tell nobody. James Foster walked onto that stage carrying 3 years of something he had never named. Not to his wife, not to his sons, not to the 2 friends who had known him through all of it. He walked off it with the name for it, and with his wife's arms around him, and with his son looking at him from across a television studio, with an expression that said everything the application form had been trying to say. Renee Foster walked on, having managed her husband's struggle with the tool she had always reached for. She walked off understanding, for the first time, where that tool had been landing. That understanding did not undo 3 years, but it began something that 3 years had not yet begun. And Steve Harvey, who knows what it is to lose the version of yourself that you built your whole life around, and to rebuild from ground level, and to carry the shame of that privately longer than it should have been carried, used his platform for exactly what a platform is for. Not to entertain, not to perform, to tell the truth to a man who needed to hear it, in a room full of people who needed to see it told. A man's struggle is not a punchline. His grief over what he has lost is not dramatic. His silence is not strength. It is the shape that pain takes when it has nowhere to go. And the most important thing the person who loves him can do is not lighten it, not manage it from a distance, not decide on his behalf that it is being handled. Ask him. Take it seriously. Stay in the room with him. That is what Steve Harvey said. That is what Renee heard. That is what James finally allowed himself to receive. And for a man who had spent 3 years going further inside, that was everything.